1863, Jim Crow was born. This character was created by white men to amuse a white audience. Jim Crow would grow to symbolize one of the most tragic events in race relation history. Promise and contradiction ruled this era. In 1865, 4 million Americans would become slaves simply because they were born black. When freedom did come their way, it was replaced by laws designated to keep them oppressed. This was the era known as Jim Crow. It was a form of racial discrimination. Most of the African Americans stayed quiet while others fought back. In the late 1880s and 90s, they started their own campaign to secure voting rights. They built their own schools, businesses, and churches. They fought to put a stop to mob violence and lynching. White supremacists fought back, and the Ku Klux Klan came on the scene and were embraced by many. White supremacy was the power behind the Jim Crow laws, and it seemed unstoppable. Over the next decade, the cruel treatment of African Americans continued. Fed up with the system, they decided to use the power of the press and the courts to pursue their quest for equality and freedom. The rise and fall of Jim Crow is the story of strength and perseverance. It is also the story of those who continue to fight for freedom, even in the face of terror. They continue to triumph, and that triumphant attitude made the world better for all of us. In 1861, the South left the Union to avoid being restricted from slavery. When the Civil War began, Abraham Lincoln called it a war that would end slavery. On January 1st, 1863, Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, freeing all slaves in Confederate states. 6 months after the South surrendered, Congress ratified the 13th Amendment that abolished slavery. The federal government said that they would support the newly freed slaves. And these newly freed slaves knew what they wanted. They wanted to vote, have equal rights in the courts, but most of all, they wanted land.
What is it that your people need now that you're free? Our people need land, and they need tools to work the land. So there we began to see the priority to own our own land.
Without their own land and their own possessions, there was no true freedom. Off the coast of South Carolina, thousands of African Americans were fulfilling their dreams of land ownership, which was mainly supplied to them by former masters who had passed on. They began to have their own schools, they had established families, and lived a community life. They heard that Lincoln had been assassinated and their future was in jeopardy. A Southerner, Andrew Jackson, was now president, and he was against freeing the slaves. He said, "This is a country for white men, and as long as I'm president, this will be a government of white men." General Oliver O. Howard slowly made his way toward the African American colony. He was known as the Christian General because he was a deeply religious man who hated slavery. He tried to protect the land given to former slaves through Congress. To the African American population, Howard was revered second only to Abraham Lincoln.
At the message from the Freedmen's Bureau that the general was coming back, General Oliver O. Howard, who they were expecting to hear nothing but good news from him because he was the man who had told them about how this land now was transferred to them and that they owned it and they didn't have to worry about massa no more and everything. He asked them to gather together at the church on Edisto. So over 2,000 people came from all amongst the oak trees and all back off in the woods and from their shacks and their dirt roads to meet there at the church to hear this new discussion about their land.
I have been sent by the President to tell you that your old masters have been pardoned and their plantations are to be given back to them, and that they would hire blacks to work for them. Lay aside your bitter feelings and be reconciled to them. General Oliver O. Howard.
So people were enraged and people started hollering out, no, ain't no way. No, that ain't what you tell us before. No, sir.
General Howard, why do you take away our lands? You take them from us who are true, always true to the government. You give them to our all-time enemies. The man who gave me 39 lashes and who stripped and flogged my mother and sister, who keeps land from me well knowing I would not have anything to do with him if I had land of my own. That man I cannot well forgive. A freedman.
In 1866, Congress recognized there were still some people who resisted change. So, it created the 14th and 15th Amendments, which guaranteed African Americans a right to vote and due process of law. However, many whites chose not to acknowledge the new laws. The people of Mississippi were not listening. They decided that white people would always be superior and that African Americans needed to know their place, which, to them, was the cotton fields of the South. But former slaves refused to be trapped after coming so far. They used their votes to elect black representatives, they sat on black juries, and they sent their children to school.
What had alarmed the white South during Reconstruction was not evidence of black failure, but evidence of black success, evidence of black assertion, evidence of black independence, evidence of black advancement, and evidence that black men were learning the uses of political power.
Those who were against the rights of African Americans resorted to violence. The same year that whites resorted to violence was the same year that Reconstruction began. Nathan Beckford Forrest, a Confederate general, founded the Ku Klux Klan. The images in white hoods killing African Americans, but the light of burning crosses would forever be a memory never to be forgotten.
The way white supremacists made sure that ex-slaves would fall back into place or nearly back into place was terror. Beating people up, burning down their houses, shooting them, just the usual physical mayhem of personal violence.
After a reign of violence, there was hope with the election of Ulysses S. Grant in 1869. he sent federal troops to the South to stop the Ku Klux Klan. However, federal intervention proved not to be enough.
The question of, should we stay at home in the South? Should we stay at home in the United States? Should we move somewhere else to the north? Should we move to the west? Or should we leave the United States entirely?
Burned out and feeling hopeless, some turned to an unlikely old man named Benny Singleton. In 1874, Singleton, a former slave, would lead a group of African Americans to Kansas. Then, John Brown stuck his blow against slavery.
We needed land for our children. That caused my heart to grieve in sorrow. Pity for my race caused me to work for them. Confidence has perished and faded away. We are going to leave the South. Pap Singleton.
Kansas may have been the promised land, but the journey was brutal. Many died from hunger and exposure to the elements. Yellow fever took several lives, but the biggest fear was encountering murderous whites. Those who survived the Kansas trip were met with harsh lands and violent tornadoes. They allowed their spiritual side to lead their way, and within a few years, over 20 towns were built. But not all African Americans thought that the answer was to leave the South. Frederick Douglass, a former slave, had become the leading African American voice opposed to a mass exodus. He said the story would be told of the hundreds who stayed in Mississippi, not the thousands who left.
The country will be told of the hundreds who go to Kansas, but not of the thousands who stay in Mississippi. They will be told of the destitute who require material aid, but not of the multitude who are bravely sustaining themselves where they are. If the people of this country cannot be protected in every state of the Union, the sovereignty of the nation is an empty one, and the power in individual states is greater than the power of the United States. Frederick Douglass.